Story number 1. The Mirror Room. The Mirror Room was more of a rumor than a reality. No one at Blackwood Academy admitted to seeing it, but everyone had heard the stories. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, hidden behind a forgotten door, was a small room lined with mirrors. The legend claimed that if you found the room, you'd see something you weren't supposed to, reflections that didn't match your movements, faces that didn't belong, or the version of yourself that had been left behind. Most students laughed it off, but not Claire. She had always been drawn to the strange and unexplained, and when she overheard 2 seniors whispering about the mirror room after school, her curiosity flared. "You shouldn't mess with that stuff," her best friend Alex warned when she told him her plan. "It's just a room," Claire said. "What's the worst that could happen?" Alex frowned. "You've clearly never heard these stories." That evening, after the janitor locked the school doors for the night, Claire slipped out from her hiding spot in the library. The building was eerily silent, her footsteps echoing in the empty hallways. The 3rd floor was rarely used, its dimly lit corridors filled with old lockers and unused classrooms. Claire walked slowly, running her fingers along the walls, looking for any sign of a hidden door. She was about to give up when she felt it. A faint draft coming from behind a loose panel. Prying it open, she found a narrow staircase leading up to a small, forgotten room. Her heart raced as she climbed. The room was exactly as the rumors described. Small, square, and lined with mirrors on every wall. They were old, their surfaces cloudy and slightly warped, but they reflected her perfectly. Or so she thought. Claire stepped into the center of the room, her breath fogging up the mirrors as she turned slowly, taking in her distorted reflections. At first, everything seemed normal, but then she noticed it. One of her reflections didn't move. She froze, staring at the still image of herself in the mirror directly ahead. Her real body trembled, but the reflection stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, its eyes locked onto hers. "Hello," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible. The reflection smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. What are you?" Claire stammered, stepping back. The reflection stepped forward, mimicking her motion, but not her fear. Its movements were too smooth, too deliberate. "Don't you recognize me?" it asked, its voice echoing unnaturally in the small room. Claire's chest tightened. "You're me." The reflection shook its head. "Not anymore." Claire turned to run, but the door was gone. Her other reflections, the ones she hadn't been watching, were no longer mirroring her either. They stood in their frames, each wearing her face, but with subtle, horrifying differences. One's smile stretched too wide. Another's eyes were black and hollow, and yet another had blood running down its cheeks. "Stay," they whispered in unison. "We've been waiting for you." "No," Claire screamed, pounding on the wall where the door had been. The mirrors began to ripple like water, the distorted reflections stepping out of their frames one by one. The first was the smiling one, its grin stretching impossibly wide as it reached for her. Claire backed into the center of the room, spinning around to face them. "Leave me alone," she shouted, her voice cracking. The reflections laughed, their voices blending into a haunting symphony. "You're ours now," one of them hissed, its face inches from hers. "No," Claire shouted, grabbing the nearest object, a shard of broken glass from the floor, and slashing at the mirror. The glass shattered, the sound deafening in the confined space. And then everything went still. Claire blinked, finding herself alone in the room again. The mirrors were intact, their surfaces reflecting her trembling figure. The door was back, slightly ajar, revealing the dark hallway beyond. Heart pounding, she bolted for the exit, not stopping until she was outside the school. Gulping in the cold night air, she didn't tell anyone what happened. But that night, as she brushed her teeth, she noticed something strange. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror didn't blink when she did. It just smiled. Story number 2. The silent student street. Helena's High was old, its stone walls weathered by decades of storms, and its halls filled with creaking floorboards. The school had its fair share of ghost stories, but the one everyone knew was about the silent student. The story went that years ago, a girl named Evelyn was locked in a supply closet during a prank gone wrong. The school was closing for the weekend, and no one heard her screams. By Monday morning, she was dead. Since then, students whispered that Evelyn's ghost wandered the halls, especially at night. They claimed you'd see her in the reflection of the windows or hear her soft sobs when you were alone. Most people thought it was just a story, until the night Kayla stayed late to finish her project. Kayla had always dismissed the ghost stories as nonsense. She wasn't easily spooked and was more concerned with meeting her deadlines than worrying about imaginary spirits. That night, the art room was empty except for her. The school felt oddly quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an oppressive silence. She worked quickly, her brush strokes precise as she painted, but as she reached for a new color, she froze. The brushes she'd neatly laid out moments ago were now scattered across the table. Kayla frowned. Weird. Shrugging it off, she continued painting, but a few minutes later, the lights flickered. Old building, she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the prickling sensation creeping up her spine. The lights flickered again, this time longer, plunging the room into near darkness before buzzing back to life. And that's when she saw it, a shadow in the corner of the room. "Hello," Kayla called, her voice trembling slightly. The shadow didn't move. It stood there, vaguely humanoid, but unnaturally still. Kayla's breath caught in her throat as she realized it wasn't casting a shadow on the floor. It wasn't attached to anything. Grabbing her bag, Kayla hurried to the door. As she reached for the handle, it slammed shut in front of her. Panic set in as she tugged and banged on the door, but it wouldn't budge. Behind her, the room grew colder and the shadow began to move, its edges dissolving and reforming like smoke. Kayla spun around, her back pressed against the door. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking. A soft, mournful whisper filled the room. "Why didn't they help me?" Kayla's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the voice. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. "I'm sorry," Kayla stammered, though she didn't know why. The shadow coalesced into a figure, a girl about her age, with pale, translucent skin and hollow eyes. Her hair hung limp and damp around her face, and her lips were tinged blue. "You can help me," the ghost whispered, stepping closer. Kayla's heart raced as she pressed harder against the door. "How? What do you want?" The ghost's head tilted unnaturally. "Stay with me." "No," Kayla screamed, lunging for the window. She pulled it open, but the cold air that rushed in felt wrong, stale, heavy, and suffocating. The ghost appeared beside her, moving without walking. Its hand reached out, passing through Kayla's arm. The touch was ice cold, and Kayla gasped as her vision blurred. She saw flashes of a dark, cramped space, the supply closet. She heard Evelyn's desperate screams, felt her pounding on the door, her voice growing weaker until it stopped entirely. Kayla stumbled back, clutching her head. When she opened her eyes, the ghost was inches away, staring at her with empty, accusing eyes. "You left me," Evelyn hissed. "No, I didn't," Kayla cried. "You all left me." The room shook violently, the walls cracking as the air filled with Evelyn's screams. Kayla scrambled for the door, her fingers fumbling with the handle until it finally gave way. She bolted into the hallway, her footsteps echoing as she ran. Behind her, the screams grew fainter, but the air remained heavy. She didn't stop running until she was outside, gasping for air. The next day, Kayla returned to school, determined to find answers. She searched the archives in the library, poring over old records and yearbooks. Finally, she found it. An article from decades ago about a girl named Evelyn who had died in a tragic accident. The article mentioned the closet where she was found, now sealed off in the basement near the boiler room. Kayla decided she needed to see it. That evening, she made her way to the basement, flashlight in hand. The air was thick and stale, and the hum of the boiler seemed unnaturally loud. She found the door easily. It was covered in peeling paint, with a rusted padlock hanging loosely. Taking a deep breath, Kayla pushed the door open. The closet was small and dark, filled with broken furniture and cobwebs. And there, in the corner, was a faint outline of a handprint on the wall. Kayla felt a chill run down her spine as the air grew colder. Behind her, a soft whisper. "You shouldn't have come back." Story number 3. The Substitute. It all started the day Mrs. Grayson, the regular English teacher, called in sick. The class was buzzing with speculation when the substitute walked in. He was tall and pale, with sharp features and deep-set eyes that seemed to take in everything. His name, written in neat chalk on the board, was Mr. Holloway. He didn't smile or introduce himself. Instead, he turned to the class and said in a voice that was calm, yet chilling, "Today, we're going to read something different." He passed out thin, yellowed booklets, the pages brittle and covered in a strange, spidery handwriting. The title on the front was unreadable, written in a language no one recognized. "What is this?" Emma whispered to her best friend Liam. "I don't know," Liam replied, flipping through the pages. The text seemed to writhe on the paper, shifting slightly every time he blinked. "Begin reading," Mr. Holloway instructed, his dark eyes scanning the room. Something about his gaze made Emma shudder, but she obeyed, her voice shaking as she read aloud. "Through the veil of shadow and fire, the gate shall open." The room grew unnervingly quiet as each student read a passage. With every word spoken, the air seemed to grow heavier, the lights dimmer. A low hum filled the room, just on the edge of hearing, like a swarm of distant bees. "Keep reading," Mr. Holloway said, his tone sharper now. Liam glanced up and noticed something strange. The windows. They weren't showing the outside anymore. Instead of the school courtyard, there was darkness. No trees, no sky. Just an endless void. "Mr. Holloway, what's going on?" Liam asked, his voice breaking. The substitute turned to him, his eyes colder than ever. "You'll understand soon enough." Emma stopped reading. "This is insane. I'm not doing this anymore." The moment she put the booklet down, she screamed. Her hands had turned gray, her veins black, as though the life was being drained out of her. "Finish the passage," Mr. Holloway said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Help her," Liam yelled, but no one moved. The other students sat rigid, their eyes wide and glassy as they continued reading, their voices now a monotone chant. Emma picked up the booklet again, sobbing, and as she read the next line, the color returned to her hands. Liam stood up, his chair screeching against the floor. "I'm not doing this," he shouted, throwing his booklet to the ground. Mr. Holloway tilted his head, studying him like a predator. "You have no choice," the substitute said, and with a flick of his hand, the door slammed shut. The hum in the room grew louder, almost deafening now. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, forming shapes, grotesque, writhing things that seemed to crawl toward the students. Emma grabbed Liam's arm. "We have to finish it," she whispered. "It's the only way out." "No," Liam said. "He's using us for something." Liam turned to the substitute. "What are you doing to us?" Mr. Holloway smiled for the first time, a thin, joyless curve of his lips. "You're opening the door," he said simply. "What door?" Emma cried. "The one that was never meant to be opened." Before Liam could respond, the shadows on the walls lunged toward him. He felt an icy grip around his chest, pulling him back toward his desk. "Read," Mr. Holloway commanded. Liam fought against the force, but it was no use. He fell back into his seat, the booklet open in front of him. The words on the page glowed faintly now, the text shifting into English. "By their voice, the seal is broken. By their fear, the gatekeeper awakens." Liam looked around the room. Most of the students had stopped chanting, their faces pale and blank, their eyes sunken. He glanced at Emma, who shook her head frantically. "We can't finish it," she said, but Mr. Holloway raised his hand again, and the words seemed to rise off the page, pulling Liam's eyes toward them. "You will finish," the substitute said. Emma grabbed the nearest object, a chair, and hurled it at the chalkboard. The impact shattered the brittle wood, breaking Mr. Holloway's focus for a moment. "Run!" she screamed, pulling Liam toward the door. It didn't open into the hallway. Instead, they stepped into a barren, red-tinged landscape, the air thick with ash and the sky boiling with dark clouds. Behind them, the classroom was gone. So was Mr. Holloway. But the hum remained, growing louder and louder until it turned into a guttural roar. And then they saw it. A towering figure emerged from the horizon, its body cloaked in shadow, its eyes glowing with a pale, sickly light. "This is what you've brought forth," a voice boomed. Mr. Holloway's voice, though he was nowhere to be seen. Emma clung to Liam, her heart pounding. "What do we do?" she whispered. Liam stared at the monstrous figure, its form blotting out the sky. "I don't think we can do anything," he said. The ground beneath them began to crack, glowing red as the creature stepped closer, and then everything went dark. The next day, St. Helena's High was empty. The classrooms were untouched, the hallways eerily silent. The students were never seen again, but sometimes, late at night, janitors swore they could hear faint whispers from the third-floor classroom. And on the chalkboard, scrawled in spidery handwriting, were the words, "The door remains open."